Hello everyone, this is Mindy Mandell here. Thank you for joining me. So in past videos, I went through the first hypothesis of Plato's Parmenides. And in my last video, I introduced the second hypothesis. And I also promised you at that time that I would do a video on Proclus's presentation of these two hypotheses. What is the significance he sees, the relationship between them? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So we're looking at Proclus's theology of Plato, and all of the quotes that I'm using come from Thomas Taylor. I'm going to give you a few quotes that I had included in the previous video because I think it's a good setup for the relationship that Proclus saw between the first and second, and it gives us a good setup of what we're going to see in the chapter that we're looking at today. So he says that it is requisite to determine this concerning the first hypothesis, that it comprehends as many conclusions negatively as the hypothesis which follows it, of course the second, does affirmatively. For this latter, the second, demonstrates all the orders proceeding from the one. But the former, the first, evinces that the one is exempt from all divine genera. So what we're going to look at today are the divine genera. He says that if the first of the hypotheses is about the one which is above all multitude, then it is doubtless necessary that the hypothesis which follows this, the second, should not unfold being itself in an indefinite and indistinct manner, but it should deliver all the orders of beings. And just to make that a little clearer, he also says in Book 1 that the order of the conclusions proceeds in conjunction with the progression of beings. And so with that introduction, I now want to jump into Book 2, Chapter 12 of his Theology of Plato, because this is where he gives us this relationship. Now, it is organized in accordance with the first hypothesis. What he does in this chapter is he focuses on the first, but he says certain categories are exempt from the one, and they are connected to this certain order of gods. And so in this roundabout way, he's showing us the order of the gods, how he connects them to the different categories. And so he's showing us the second hypothesis, but he's doing it by saying, and this order of gods is also exempt from the first hypothesis one. Excuse me, the first hypothesis one is exempt from the category. This is the order of the categories in the first hypothesis. Now you will notice when you compare this to the second hypothesis that it is the same order, except that being and one are at the end of the first hypothesis. But we started the second hypothesis with the one being. I talked about that in my previous video, and I will link it at the end for those who haven't seen it. So he starts the second hypothesis with the one being, and then he goes on to the many and all the other categories. And so we're going to look at those here today, those other categories. As far as why does he put being in one at the end of the first hypothesis? Well, Proclus does have some thoughts about that. It's at the end of this chapter that we're looking at today, and so it'll be at the end of this video. But he's going to start this discussion with the many and the part and whole. And so following from that highest manifestation of reality, the one being. Okay, with that long introduction, let's jump into it. So he says that the first hypothesis one is exempt from the many. The many, however, subsist primarily in the summit of the first intellectual gods and in the intelligible place of survey, as we are taught in the second hypothesis. The one, therefore, entirely transcends an order of this kind and is the cause of it. A few things here. First of all, one of the great difficulties of reading the theology of Plato is that the first time you read the book, and it's quite thick, the first time through, it really is just a struggle to figure out the very metaphysics that he's basing it on. It's like if you don't know what he means by the summit of the first intellectual gods and the intelligible place of survey, this means nothing to you. And so the first time we read it, we tend to just be drawing little diagrams and trying to figure out the order of things so that we can read the book again and then get some sense out of it. So I am going to go through some of the metaphysics here so that this will hopefully make a little more sense. Before I do that, though, I do want to point out here the organization of this chapter. And what we're seeing here is that he is connecting the many to a certain order of gods, And then he says that the first hypothesis, one, entirely transcends an order of this kind and is the cause of it. And so that's the basic organization we're seeing throughout. On the surface, he's talking about the first hypothesis, but by connecting each of the terms or the categories to some order of gods, he's also telling us something about the second hypothesis. Okay, now I'm going to go a little bit into the metaphysics, and I'm going to take this in steps. So first, let's take a look at the intelligible realm as a triad. Now, in its most unified sense, we can call it the one being. And we saw that in last week's video. But what I'm going to look at here is the intelligible as a triad. And there are various terms that we use when we're talking about it, depending on what point we're making or what it is we want to see about it. So we often refer to it as being, life, and intellect, going clockwise around the triangle here. So that's one way of talking about it, is being, life, and intellect, being that is. So this is like the one that is in its highest sense, again, the one being. Another way that we talk about the intelligible is abiding, proceeding, and reverting. At that summit, it is all three moments, and they're often called moments. They're not truly separate, but we divide them in our mind so that we can talk about them and have deeper insights into them. But they're not truly separate. In fact, the intelligible is the most unified of all the realms. And so these divisions that we're making are more for us than anything else. But abiding is that sense of the intelligible in its most unified, because it's all abiding. Life and intellect are abiding in being. When we get to proceeding, this is the life, the motion, the power of moving away, of proceeding away from the cause. And when we talk about reverting, it's that intellectual reversion of turning back to its cause to know itself, and then to, and for the next realm to flow from it. Now, another way of talking about the intelligible are terms like these: undifferentiated, or unified is another term, differentiating, and differentiated. So when all is abiding together in one, it's undifferentiated, it's united, it's the most united of the triad. Differentiating, that process of moving away, there's now in a process of differentiating, but it's not yet broken into parts. That's where you get to intellect, where you have the home. This is the home of the intelligible forms, because now we can make distinctions, beauty and justice and so on. It's differentiated. One other way I want to talk about it, and there are other terms besides the one I'm giving here, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to give you one more. We can sometimes talk about being as one, and that's when, in its highest sense, it's the one being, or the one that is. And that's really where the second hypothesis begins. So at the most unified, it's one. As it's differentiating, pulling away, it's moving from one to all, but it's not yet broken into parts, so we call it whole. And in its final manifestation there, we see it as all. Okay, so we're taking this in steps. So let's hold on to this idea for a moment and then go back to the quote we were just looking at. Remember, we're looking for the first intellectual gods, the intelligible place of survey. And we see that it transcends an order of this kind, an order of gods. So now Proclus is referring to orders of gods. So now I'm going to give you a different schema here. Oh, let me give you one more quote. Sorry, I forgot. I put this here too. After the intelligible order of gods, so just clarifying there that he's talking about orders of gods, he gives subsistence to that order which connectedly contains and bounds the extent of them from their exempt cause. But this order is caused by him in the second hypothesis, parts and a whole. We saw the word whole when we were looking at the intelligible, one, whole, all. So we can see that that middle part is what we're talking about when we talk about whole. Well, now let's look at it as orders of gods. So that triad I gave you before, we can talk about as intelligible gods. Following from that is the order of what he calls intelligible and at the same time intellectual gods. These follow from the intelligible, and so they've moved away to being intellectual, but because they are connected to the extremity of the intelligible and have that proximity to them, they are in their own, in a sense, also intelligible, and they are that seat, that intelligible point of survey. I forget exactly how it was worded before, that he was referring to before. Now, because it's a long name, I'm going to pull out the I and I, and I'm going to refer to them as I and I gods because it's just too long of a name, intelligible and at the same time intellectual. Okay, so but we have these first two orders of gods, and then we have, following that, the intellectual gods. These gods, again, they are a step down, a further progression away from the intelligible. And so there's a sense in which times Proclus talks about them as being separate from the intelligible gods. However, and this gets confusing, there's also a sense in which he talks about them as also being intelligible, because as intellect they revert to their cause, the intelligible gods, and know those gods. And so there is a sense in which we can talk about them also as intelligible. And so sometimes these three realms are called the divine realms. They're collectively the divine realms. This is where Proclus gets really confusing because we are outside of time and space. We want to see a very smooth transition, a linear transition as we progress downward, but we have to challenge those assumptions of time and space that we bring to our linear way of thinking about things. So there are times he talks about these as separate worlds, each following from the extremity of the previous realm, and it's a chain that has no spaces in it. But there's also a sense in which he talks about these three orders of gods as being the intelligible order, looked at triadically. Being is a triad, life is a triad, intellect as a triad. And when he does that, that's when he's talking about them as the divine order as a whole. And so all of the terminology that we used to describe the intelligible can be used to describe these three separate realms or worlds. So we can talk about the intelligible gods as one, as undifferentiated, as all abiding in itself. We can talk about it as being. And all of the terms that we use to describe intelligible life can be used to describe these gods. And these gods are all vivific gods because they all follow from life. And the third order of gods are all intellectual gods. And again, they revert back to the intelligible order of gods and create the divine realms. And so when he's talking about part and whole, he's talking about whole as in that wholeness that is intelligible life. And when he talks about parts, he's talking about as a triad, that is where the parts are. So he says that we may survey the order which is allotted, the boundary of the intellectual and at the same time intelligible gods, what I was calling I and I gods, and proceeding from the one. And we may behold the one perfectly expanded above it. That's that intelligible place of survey. For this order, the second order, the order of intelligible life, indeed subsists from the second genera, and from the intellectual wholeness of the genera. So there's a sense in which it subsists from intelligible life. And so here are the terms in the Parmenides that he is attaching to this order of gods. He says the first hypothesis, one, as has been demonstrated, is exempt according to cause from this wholeness. The one, therefore, has neither beginning nor middle nor end, nor has it extremes, nor does it participate of any figure. So all of these terms that we saw in the second hypothesis, he is connecting to that second order of gods. Okay, after these triple orders, the orders of the intelligible gods we saw as a triad and the I and I gods as a triad, after these two sets of triple orders, we must direct our attention to the intellectual gods subsisting from these, so that third order of gods. And they also receive a tripartite division, and we must demonstrate that the one transcends these also. Okay, when Proclus talks about the intellectual gods, he often uses their mythological names. And we have Kronos at the summit, his wife Rhea in the middle, and their bouncing baby boy Zeus at the extremity. And Thomas Taylor will often use the Romanized names, Saturn and Jupiter. So I gave you those as well. And now what I want to do is show you the terms from the Parmenides that Proclus sees as connecting to these three gods. Again, now to get more of the detail of the why, I do strongly encourage you to read the theology of Plato. It is a real challenge, but I think that the very effort that it takes to try to figure out what he's talking about has a theurgic benefit to us. So it's the very work that we need to do to mature our souls. So I definitely recommend tackling this work, even though it is a very big challenge. To talk about Chronos, I'm actually going to jump to book 5, where Proclus covers the intellectual gods. By the way, I forgot to say this before. The Intelligible Gods, or the Intelligible Order of Gods, is covered in book 3 of his Theology of Plato. Proclus talks about the I and I gods, or the intelligible and at the same time intellectual gods. They're the focus of book 4. The intellectual gods are the focus of book 5. And I pulled this one quote from book 5 just because it's more succinct, and so it works well in a video like this. He says that Chronos, he connects to the idea of in itself and in another. He says, so far indeed as Chronos is a total intellect, his energy is directed to himself. But so far as he is in the intelligibles prior to himself, he establishes in another the all-perfect intelligence of himself. And so there's a sense in which, as the summit of the intellectual triad, he's connected to the end of the I and I God triad. So there's a sense in which he has that higher knowledge. So in another is actually more profound than being in himself in this sense, and for Chronos. Okay, so those are the terms that Proclus connects to in itself and in another. About Rhea, going back now to book 2, chapter 12, he connects Rhea to at rest and in motion. He says the one likewise generates the second intellectual order, being unmingled with it, so that she's the second within the intellectual order of gods. For the one neither stands still nor is moved. It participates therefore of neither of these, but being similarly exempt from both, it at the same time transcends the middle orders of the intellectual progression of the gods. So we see that now he is saying that the one of the first hypothesis is exempt from the idea of at rest and in motion. And he's connecting that again to the middle of the triad of intellectual gods. And then going on to Zeus, he connects Zeus to the idea of same and different. He says, in the third place, we may survey through what next follows the last order of intellectuals, proceeding from the one and subordinate to it. For in this order, sameness and difference subsist unitedly. Okay, so that gives us the intellectual gods. Now, after the intellectual gods, the ineffable transcendency of the one arranges the extent of the super-mundane divinities. The one, in the meantime, the one of the first hypothesis, is occultly exempt from its super-mundane progeny. So we're seeing here also that not only is the first hypothesis one exempt from all of these orders, but we see that it arranges the orders that it is exempt from. And we're going to see that also at the end of this chapter. Now, what are the super-mundane divinities? Well, moving away from triads for a moment, we can organize the basic flow that we're seeing of these realms. We have the intelligible gods, and then the intelligible and at the same time intellectual gods, and then we have the intellectual gods. These collectively we can call the divine realms, although of course all the realms are divine in the sense that they're divine orders because they're all gods. But these three are the ones that have both their essence and their activity outside of time. Now we get to the super-mundane gods, and these are the gods that, and this is the name that Proclus gives to those gods that he connects to the realm of soul, and that's where we are now. He says the super-mundane realm proximately subsists from the intellectual gods. It was the next one in that ordering, but it uniformly receives its hyparxis from the first god. Remember, it is the god of the one of the first hypothesis that gives the progression of the realms to the second hypothesis. This, therefore, Parmenides produces through similitude and dissimilitude, or in many translations, like and unlike. And so because he sees a similitude of the super-mundane realm to the divine realms, he connects this to similitude and dissimilitude. So what therefore remains after this? Is it not evident that it is the multitude of the mundane gods? So adding to our list, we now have the mundane gods. However, some of you may be familiar with there being 6 realms of gods. So we've seen in other places him talking about a realm of nature. He does include it here as well, but he sees them within as a category within the mundane gods. So he calls the mundane gods twofold. One is celestial and the other sublunary. Sometimes we've seen the word liberated used to describe the gods of nature, and there is a certain sense in which he uses liberated and sometimes celestial, and I'm not going to go into that. In this video, it's covered in book 7, it would be. Thomas Taylor added a book 7, and where he pulled writings from other places of Proclus's that talked about these gods. Book 6 being the supermundane realm. Okay, but here we're talking about the realm of nature as celestial and what we often call the mundane realm as sublunary, or the realm of materiality. Okay, so we can add those here as branches within the mundane gods. So there are 6 orders, and so 6 divine orders of gods, although the first 3 are the ones that are the divine realms in the sense that they are outside of time. Their activity and their essence are outside of time. The mundane realm is within the realm of time, and the supermundane is the mediator between the two. Okay, so he says that the genus which revolves in the heavens, the celestial gods, they proceed together with the equal, the greater, and the less. And then as for the sublunary, he says the equal is allotted a difference in multitude from the celestial equality. So as we progress downward, we have more differentiation. So there's in Platonic metaphysics, there's a direct correlation between unity and power or potency. As the realms proceed downward, they become more differentiated, and they have a power that is less than their immediate cause, but it's their own proper power for that realm. And so they have a different number. And so that's why he says there's a difference in multitude from the celestial equality. It's the proper number for that realm. The unequal is again divided by the power of the more and the less. And so I may be splitting hairs here, but he put together, remember these 2 realms together, the sublunary and the celestial gods together make up the mundane gods, and they're connected to the ideas of equal and unequal and any words connected to that. So besides all of these divine orders, they're all divine in the sense that those are orders of gods. Now we're going to move beyond the orders of gods. We must intellectually survey the genera of deified souls, which are distributed about the gods. So now we're moving away from the wholes of the realms of gods to the multiplicity of souls divided around these realms. And here we're dealing with our souls in the sense of being that we can participate in nous. The rational part of our soul can be deified in that sense of participating in nous. We're also looking at like daimons and heroes and angels. Again, all discussed in book 7, in Thomas Taylor's book 7 of Proclus's Theology of Plato. So when he's talking about these souls, we're talking about souls that still have their essence in eternity, but now have an activity in time. So now we're dipping down to that last of the categories in the second hypothesis. We're dealing with time and all of the words connected to that. So the psychical extent is characterized by time and by a life according to time. And we now therefore come to the end of the whole distribution of more excellent natures, and the cause of all intelligibles at once unfold into light the genera that follow the gods, and that are triply divided by the 3 parts of time. The 3 parts of time, of course, past, present, and future. And so all of the words connected to that. That which is the first of all things, therefore, unfolds into light all the gods, the divine souls, and the more excellent genera, and is neither complicated with its progeny nor multiplied about them, but being perfectly exempt from them in an admirable simplicity and transcendency of union, it imparts to all things indifferently both their progression and at the same time the order in the progression. And so the significance of this, what Proclus is pointing to here, is that there is a connection between the first and second hypothesis, that it is the first hypothesis one that is not only the cause of the second hypothesis, of that whole unfolding and that whole progression of being, but also the order of those terms. And so the significance I see in Parmenides assigning or having a certain order in the way that he negates these different categories, and the connection that Proclus makes to each of those categories as far as an order of gods, is he's really focusing here and stressing here that this order of the progression of the second hypothesis comes from the first hypothesis, one. So you have to see the first hypothesis as the conditions for the second. And when I go on to the third, you'll see the second as the conditions for the third. He goes on here to say that Parmenides proceeds thus far according to the measures of generation, giving subsistence to the genera of the gods and to the natures that are united to and follow the gods. But again, from hence, he returns to the beginning. So now we're looking at why in the first hypothesis are being and one denied at the end of the hypothesis instead of at the beginning. And one significance of it is what Proclus suggests here, is that Parmenides is imitating the conversion of the whole of things, that whole conversion back to its cause, to that highest. It separates the one from the highest, from even the intelligible gods. For thus especially we may survey the transcendency of the first hypothesis one, and the immense difference of its union from all other things, if we not only demonstrate that it is established above the second and third progressions in the divine orders. Remember, the divine orders were the intelligible gods, the what I call the I and I gods, and the intellectual gods. And now he's saying that the first hypothesis one is not only established above the second and the third progressions in those divine orders, but also that it subsists prior to the intelligible unities themselves. The intelligibles are naturally adapted to be known by intellect. This, therefore, Parmenides also evinces, energizing according to intellect and asserting that the one is above essence and being characterized by the one. And so he ended the first hypothesis by saying that this one is exempt from essence and even exempt from the one. And then, of course, the second hypothesis opened with the one being, and it went down as far as to time, as I showed in my last video. So I hope that helped you see a little bit of the connection between the first and second. Of course, to get more into those categories and why exactly, there's quite a bit of detail that Proclus gives in his Theology of Plato. You do have to go through the book. I gave you here just the what of it, just the map of it. And that's, I think, a good starting point. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. If you watched the video this far, I hope that means you liked it, and so please hit the like button and subscribe if you don't already. I'm going to go on to the third hypothesis next. I think that it begs the question, if we've already covered the whole progression of gods, why do we need a third hypothesis? So I'm going to talk about that in my next video. Thank you very much.